When we want to solve by factoring, the first thing we always want to do is get everything on one side of the equation equal to 0. In order to do that, you always change the sign. For example, this 5x, we would subtract 5x on both sides, right? These are not like terms, so we have to write them separate. So essentially, we change the sign to move it to the other side. So now, the next thing we have to do is recognize which method we need to use when factoring. This method, we're going to look at the two terms, there are only two terms, and look and see if there is a greatest common factor between these two terms. Is there something that we can factor out of these two terms? In this case, there's an x, so we can factor out an x. Now, factoring out is the inverse of multiplying, so it is dividing. So 2x squared divided by x, we're left with a 2. You subtract the exponents. If there's no exponent, it's understood to be a 1. So 2 minus 1 leaves us x to the 1, and we don't need to write x to the 1. Minus 5x divided by x leaves us with just a 5, because x to the 1 minus x to the 1 is x to the 0, which is 1. So 1 times a 5, or in this case a negative 5, is 5. Then we always set each term equal to 0. Well, there's x equals 0, leaving us with 0. Then there's 2x minus 5 equals 0. So 2x minus 5 equals 0. We would add 5 to both sides. 2x equals positive 5. And then we would divide by 2. So x would equal 5 over 2. So now let's look at this. Like I said previously, the first step is always to move everything to the other side. So we have a negative x squared. We subtract x squared from both sides. So 2x squared minus x squared, these are like terms. So we would add their coefficients. A 2 minus 1 leaves us with 1x squared, so we just write x squared. And then we also add a 1. Negative 50 plus 1 is a negative 49 equals 0. Now from here, we have to recognize that this is a difference of two squares. A negative meaning difference. And we can write this as x squared minus 7 squared, because 49 is a perfect square, it's 7 squared. And when you have a difference of two squares, you always factor them as we're going to have an x and a 7. So we're going to have the two terms. We're going to have a plus in between and a minus in between. And if you were to multiply this out, you would see that the middle terms would cancel, because you would have a negative 7x plus 7x, leaving you with 0. So you would only have the first term, which is x squared, and the last term, 7 times a negative 7, is a negative 49. And then from here, when we're solving, we always put both of the terms, or each term, equal to 0. We would subtract 7 to solve, leaving us with a negative 7. We would add 7 to solve, leaving us with a positive 7. So x is equal to negative 7, positive 7. We always put the smaller number first when putting it in set notation. All right, once again, the first thing we always do is move everything over on one side of the equation equal to 0. So we have this x squared, so we're going to subtract x squared, or 2x squared minus x squared is x squared. Then we have a negative x, so we're going to add x. A negative 9x plus x is a negative 8x. And then we have this minus 65 equals 0. So now with the previous two, we were left with binomials, which means there's two terms. Now we're left with a trinomial. And our lead coefficient, so our coefficient of x squared is a 1. So now we can go straight to factoring this trinomial into two binomials. So what we want are two numbers that multiply to negative 65 and add to be a negative 8. Okay, so because they multiplied to be a negative 65, because they multiplied to be a negative number, that means one has to be positive and one has to be negative. Okay, so when you're adding a negative and a positive, you're subtracting. So we want to subtract to be 8. And what I usually do is just take the 65 and start dividing numbers and then subtract them and see and mess with it until you get something that works. In this case, it's going to end up being a negative 13 and a positive 5, because that ends up adding to a negative 8. Okay, so the 13 has to be the larger number since the 8 is a negative, and then the 5 is the positive. Now, once we have this factored, we set each factor equal to 0. So now we have x plus 5 equals 0 and x minus 13 equals 0. So we subtract to 5 and we add 13. So when writing the answer, we always write the smallest number first, right? And there is our answer. All right, now we're going to talk about the AC method. So let's say we have 2x squared equals x plus 21. All right, just like always, we want to move everything to one side equal to 0. So we would get 2x squared minus x minus 21 equals 0. Notice when you move it over, the sign changes. If it was positive before, it becomes negative. If it was negative before, it would become positive. Now, the reason we know we need to use the AC method is because our a, which is our coefficient of x squared, or also known as our lead coefficient, right here, is a 2, which is greater than 1. When this is not a 1, we are going to want to use the AC method. Now this is called the AC method because when you have this is standard form. Standard form is what it's called for the equation to be all on one side equal to 0, and it's in the form of ax squared plus bx plus c equals 0. So we're going to take our a and our c, in this case it's 2 and negative 21, and we're going to multiply them together. 2 times negative 21, and that is negative 42. So we want two factors of negative 42. So we want two numbers that multiply together to be 42 and add to be a negative 1, and that's because that's what our b is. Our b is a negative 1, right? So now because they multiply to be a negative, that means one has to be a negative and one has to be a positive. And what happens when you're adding a negative and a positive? You're subtracting. So we want to find two factors of 42 that subtract to be 1, which means they're only going to be 1 apart from each other, right? Well, what about 7 and 6? Now the larger one is going to have to be negative because they add to be a negative 1, right? So let's look at, we know that if you have a negative 7 times a positive 6, you'd get a negative 42, so that would work. So what about 6 minus 7? Does that give you a negative 1? Yes, it does. So I'm going to go back up to this. I'll go ahead and rewrite it. 2x squared minus x minus 21 equals 0. Now, unlike our other method, with the AC method, we just want to separate this middle term. So our first term and our last term are going to stay the same. So it's 2x squared. We're going to have a plus 6x minus 7x minus 21 equals 0. So now that I've separated that middle term, I'm going to look at these first two terms, and I'm going to say, okay, what can I factor out of these two terms? So look for a greatest common factor. Well, let's see. 2 is a factor of both 2 and 6, so I can factor out a 2. And look, they both have an x, so I'm going to factor out a 2x. Now, 2 divided by 2 is 1. X squared divided by x, I'm taking out 1x, I'm left with 1x. Plus 6x divided by 2x, 6 divided by 2 is 3, x divided by x is 1. Now I'm going to look over here at these two terms. What can I factor out? Now if I do this correctly, I'm going to be left with an x plus 3. So I'm going to factor out a negative 7. Does that give me an x plus 3? When I factor out a negative, it's going to change our sign, so that's going to be a positive, and then 21 divided by 7 is 3. That's what we want. Now, we can look at this as this is one term, and this is another term, right? So if I factor out an x plus 3 from these two terms, what am I left with from this, the first term? Well, I'm left with a 2x. When I factor it out, x plus 3 out of the second term, what am I left with? Well, negative 7 or minus 7, right? And then I want to put both of these equal to 0. So when you have two factors equal to 0, the only way they can multiply to be 0 is if one of them or the other is a 0, right? Or both. So I'm going to put x plus 3 equals 0, and if x plus 3 equals 0, what does x equal? Well, we have to subtract the 3, so x would equal negative 3, right? And then if I put 2x minus 7 equals 0, I would add the 7, making it 2x equals 7, and then I would divide by 2. So x is going to equal 7 over 2. So the way we write that, and I'll write it up here, and I'm sorry it's getting a little messy. We always write our smaller numbers first, so negative 3, comma 7 over 2. And then I'm going to close the squiggly bracket, but you can't really see that. I'll get better at using this, I promise, with experience.